The Lord be with you. Before I pray, does anyone have prayers that you would like lifted up together?
Ed Lester.
Ed Lester, yes.
Yes.
And there's lots of sicknesses going around too. Any other prayers? Ask you to pray for my mom. She hurt her arm, maybe from overuse, but her tendon has separated from her elbow. My mom, yes. So she has 10 days of not using her arm. And there's one thing she looks forward to every year, this kayak event that's on Saturday, and she can't do it now. And she can hold no grandkids, they told her. So she's very sad. I'm not sure which one she's more sad about.
Are there ill people that we should know about?
My family was sick this past week, but we are better now, for the most part. Oh my. I'm going to pass around these handouts for today. And do y'all have any prayers that you'd like lifted up today? Any prayers you'd like lifted up?
I have one.
Yes.
My grandson is taking his step to a medical exam that paves the way for residency. So prayers for Jack.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, the Lord be with you. My God, we lift up these things that weigh heavy on our hearts or stressful in our minds, in particular for Jack and his exam, for Ed and his health at the hospital, and for all those who suffer with sickness or other hard times. May you be with us, and we be with each other. Amen.
Amen. Alexander, do you know how Suzanne is doing?
I'm going to see her right after class. She's doing good. She can still not drive, but we're going to go out and get burgers. It's Suzanne, because she had her hip replaced. But she was doing good. We talked on the phone earlier this week, and she's moving around. She just can't drive yet.
Yeah.
You know,
I wrestled with that question you gave us all week long. That was much more than a 3-minute question.
Which question was it?
The truth to power.
Oh,
the
yes.
one standing up.
Okay, you'll be happy to know that we're going to revisit that question. Is our first question. So, Daniel really is a book that pushes you forward and asks how you will act in your own time. And so, we will revisit almost the same question today. I want to show you all the schedule because next week is our last week in Daniel, and then we are going to take a break for the rest of June. We will pick up on July 3rd. We will have a special topic. I don't know that special topic yet, but we will have one. And then after that, we will begin a new study. I was talking to Joy and Joan in the library yesterday, and I think what I want to do, and they told me, or Joan, she's like, well, you should just do what you want to do. So we're going to do 4 weeks of epistles, and we might go a little farther. And then we'll pick up another big book when we get back to the regular, not summer schedule. So we'll do some Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians. I don't know how many weeks I will assign to them, but if you are bored in June and you want to start reading ahead, we will do those 4 books, and they're all pretty short. So yeah, I'll have more details that will come out. Hopefully next week we'll have that schedule filled. This is where we were last week. We were in these core stories of resistance. Someone forgot about chapter 6, and so we're going to do that today. And I think that maybe God wanted us to wait because it actually tied up better with last week and with this week. But what we did talk about last week was chapter 3, 4, and 5. And we talked about the fiery furnace, and that is when Nebuchadnezzar builds this big statue. Everyone bows down to worship it and except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you'll remember, it's this comical tale, and it makes fun of the Babylonians. And it gives these long lists, and it's in descending order of every court official in the Assyrian, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Babylonian Empire. It uses all these different terms. And then it goes through just about every musical instrument that you can think of. And it keeps these long lists and keeps listing them. It's supposed to be funny when you read it. And so even though it's kind of a funny tale, there's these powerful moments in it. And the one that really stands out to me is verses 17 and 18. Our God is able to deliver us, but if not, we will not serve your gods. There is this boldness that you hear from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to see it with Daniel today too. And so that is why I'm calling all of this part, it's the stories of resistance, because they are not going to bow down to these other gods and this other way of living. And so if you'll remember throughout the book, it's Daniel living with integrity in the empire. And so they continue with that integrity by resisting. Nebuchadnezzar has a bad dream, and then he has a bad couple of years where he lives like a beast. In this dream that he has, it's this giant tree, and all the birds from all around the world come there, and it gets cut down. And that is kind of the fall of Babylon being pre-told. He also has this beautiful prayer. We talked about that prayer. God's sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty. God's kingdom endures from generation to generation. And he goes on to talk about how God puts people in place and he can take them out of place. And we're going to see the fall of Babylon as they get taken out of place. And that's where we ended last week in chapter 5. Belshazzar is, in the story, is Nebuchadnezzar's son. He is having this big feast, and kind of to rub salt in a wound, he's using the sacred vessels from the temple, and they're drinking from it in a, think of your worst college party, and that's what they're doing. And so there ends up this writing on the wall. And we talked about how it's also humorous because the words sound like Medes and Persians. And it's you've been counted, you've been weighed, and you will be divided. And so this kingdom will end. And that very night is the end of Belshazzar's life, and it's the end of the Babylonians. And then that joyous question that you all love it when I make you talk about them. There was 3 really big parts that stand out there. That courageously refusing idolatry, speaking truth to power, but with compassion, and then also declaring God's message or judgment without compromise. That is where we ended last week on this discussion. And I'm glad that you thought about it all week long. And remember, I keep talking about Daniel as this living tale. It's a story that we should keep telling today. And so fill in your name with Daniel. Fill in your friends with Daniel's friends. And fill in the Big Bag Empire with wherever you are living. And it's about living with integrity in that world. Because wherever we are, it's not always God's world. And it's never quite God's world. Yeah.
Do you have any more sheets for the...
Oh, I think there is more.
Please. Thank you. Thank you.
Whew, okay. That was where we were last week. As we go forward, we're switching today from these stories of resistance. We're going to start to move into the visions of hope. It's Marcia's favorite apocalyptic tales. And this week is the fun apocalyptic tales. Next week, they get a little weird. And so that is why in our schedule next week, we're going to move through the weird ones kind of fast. And we'll also talk about the Greek editions. That also means that next week, we don't have time to watch the Bible Project video because it's just going to be too much content and there will be less discussion questions. But we are going to watch the video at the end of today's class. Now, on your summary sheet, this is the first paragraph for the handout. Daniel 6 through 8 transitions from the dramatic court stories of resistance to apocalyptic visions of hope and judgment. In chapter 6, Daniel's refusal to stop praying lands him in the lion's den, where God protects him, showing that faithfulness can endure even under unjust power. Chapters 7 and 8 shift to the apocalyptic visions. Daniel sees 4 beasts, representing empires, a divine courtroom, and a son of man who receives everlasting dominion from God. These images speak to the rise and the fall of oppressive kingdoms and point to God's ultimate justice. In chapter 8, the visions of the ram and the goat zooms in on the Greek Empire and persecution under, I don't know how to say his name, but I call it Antiochus IV, assuring that even when holy things are desecrated, God's timeline and victory are still unfolding. Together, these chapters encourage us to live faithfully, speak truth, and trust in God's enduring rule amid worldly chaos. I wanted to read that summary for you because we have a discussion question that we're going to start off with. Daniel remained faithful in prayer even when it meant facing death. Later, he saw visions showing that the empires of this world will fall, but God's kingdom endures forever. In a world full of political, cultural, and personal pressures, what does it look like for us to live faithfully in the empire today? Where do you feel called to courage, endurance, or a hopeful vision? We're going to start off with a discussion question, and we're including next week's discussions today, so it'll be a little more discussion time. But this is how we're going to start for today. So I'm going to start the timer when I find my mouse, and you all can break up into your discussion groups.
She told me what's the latest and they're showing it on CNN. She's like, and I wrote about 7 o'clock. I didn't yeah, I wrote it.
Gosh, that scared me. I know, that made me jump.
It's a defibrillator.
That was a very short 3 minutes. I'll say this for this question, because we ended last week and we're starting this week with similar questions. Keep thinking about this as we go forward with Daniel next week, and keep thinking about it in the weeks when we're going to be done with Daniel. Daniel really does paint this ideal tale of someone we can all strive to be like. Daniel is the picture of someone we are supposed to be. I think when I was in college, they called Daniel the ideal Jew, or the idealized Jew. I'm not Jewish, so say he's the ideal of following God in a broken world. And so keep holding on to this question. We're not going to kind of break it up here. But as we go forward with today's class and next week, hold on to this. Think about it through this lens. When we get into chapter 6, we're going to see Darius's decree and then Daniel in the lion's den. And that starts off in the first 9 verses. We're going to see some jealousy. This is a picture of jealousy. Darius pops up in the story. He is this Mede, and the Medo-Persian Empire was kind of together. Darius is not someone we have a historical record of. He kind of pops up here. Remember, Daniel's this living tale that flows, and it can be any figure. So I like to think that they threw Darius in just to make a point to say, it doesn't matter who's in charge. Always be like this. Always be like Daniel. And so he pops up, and they gather together 3 governors, essentially, to reign over all of the empire, which is now the Medo-Persian Empire. It's not Babylonian anymore. And Daniel, because he was so awesome, because he has lived with integrity, a lot like Joseph back in the book of Genesis, is selected to be one of these who's going to kind of rule over everyone. And so there is jealousy. So there comes this plot against Daniel. They keep trying to find something that they can get him on. They're like, everyone has, skeletons in their closets. And so they keep looking, and Daniel has none. And so they make this plot. They go up to the king, and they're like, oh, king, you're so awesome. Why don't for 30 days everyone has to pray and worship you, and they can pray and worship no other human or no other god. And so that is the plot. They're trying to use Daniel's integrity against him because they know Daniel will be so faithful that he won't bow down to this decree, that he will still worship God and he won't worship the king. Just going to say, you think they would learn their lesson by now. Because kind of the same thing keeps happening. Daniel, because he's Daniel, refuses. And so Daniel's practice was to pray in this open window. And he would pray there 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. I think I told you all that I had trouble finding a picture that I liked for Daniel. And the reason is because I love this story of Daniel in the lion's den. But I love the image of Daniel praying. And that's why I made the picture for ours, which is Daniel praying, but in the lion's den. And so it kind of puts these two together. Because I couldn't find one that represented both. And so because Daniel is following in this integrity, he is praying 3 times a day, he ends up getting in a trap. In the story, you could kind of think about it like this, that they're in a constitutional monarchy almost. And so there's already a law in place, and the king cannot supersede a law that he has kind of stamped with his signet ring, almost like the Constitution overtakes the monarch. Never mind. And so when the king has made this decree, he can't save Daniel from this, even though the king loves Daniel. And he loves Daniel because he's lived with integrity. The king knows Daniel's not going to stab him in the back like all these other guys. Again, this is a picture for us to follow, to be like Daniel. The lion's den gets sealed. I put this as a fun fact in the back, but kind of the way that this would work, it might be like a big pit. Again, it makes me think about Joseph when they put him down in the pit. And they would Other cultures, not just Babylonians or Persians, the Assyrians would do this too. They would use animals. Romans did it too because animals are scary. They would starve the animals for a few days so the animals were ferociously hungry. And then they would, put the people there to fight against them. Have anyone seen the Gladiator movie with Russell Crowe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they do that in that movie too. They starve the lions and the tigers. I think there's other animals, and then they put Russell Crowe in there to fight. If you want a kind of visualization of what Daniel might have went through, you should maybe watch that scene from that movie. So they seal this up. They lower him down and they seal it up, and they leave him there overnight. Let's see. I think that's all I wanted to say about that part. What ends up happening is that the king comes out and he calls to Daniel, and Daniel responds. And I do like the response, and I want to just read it. It's in verse 20. When he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel then said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him. Also before you, O king, I have done no wrong." I really like this exchange for two parts. I like the king's his call to Daniel, because the king knows who's in charge, which it's not him, and it's not this other law that has kind of led to Daniel's trap. It's God, and he knows it's God because of the way Daniel has lived. So Daniel has lived his life as a witness, so that this most powerful man in the world knows that Daniel's God is the one in charge. I also like Daniel's response. If someone threw me in a lion's den, I would probably be mad at them. I would not respond with, "Oh, I hope you live forever." And so I want to just make note of Daniel's continued integrity and his respect for those in the positions of power. Okay? He respects the power dynamics where he lives, and he continues in that dynamic with integrity. To me, that's a powerful witness, because I don't do that. And I don't think I'm the only one. And so I just want to make note of this way that Daniel exchanges. So I had to put call and response because I knew I would forget to say that. What ends up happening out of this is that the accusers get sentenced with the punishment that was supposed to happen to Daniel. You may remember back in class, you learned about different types of irony. This is what we would call dramatic or situational irony. And so oftentimes in stories, you have this dramatic irony. That's what this is. And so what happens is that the accusers of Daniel and their wives and their children is what's in the text. I want to make a note of that. In ancient cultures, women and children were considered property of the men. So the punishment that would happen to the men would also happen to their family. This is not the Bible endorsing that. It's speaking in the culture. But there is one lesson that we can take from this. When we do things wrong, it has more repercussions than just ourselves. And so Daniel's integrity spreads to the kings around him. The accusers' maliciousness spreads to their family. And so I tried to find for something hopeful in that, and that's what I found. And so the accusers get sentenced, and this is some irony. Then we're going to see this beautiful prayer from Darius. I didn't put it up on the screen, but I'll draw your attention to it starting in verse 25. So then King Darius wrote to all the people and the nations of every language throughout the whole world, which is the empire, because they were so powerful it was the whole known world. May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people shall tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall not be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. the result of this is that Daniel is then elevated to a new kind of position of power. To me, this story is so powerful. The integrity that Daniel has, the witness that he has to all of those around him, it ends up reaching to the whole world. What a witness. And again, remember, this is a story that we are called to live like. So no matter where you go, almost imagine there's like a camera fall. This is how I grew up, and it was like creepy. But like what they told us is like, imagine there's a camera following you around, and so make sure what you do is always good. That's not to be like creepy or judgmental, but that is this way of living. When we live as a people of God, we carry the name of God with us. And Daniel knew that. So even though he's living in this foreign world and it threatened his life, he continued to live with that witness of God. And the whole world was blessed by it because they got to see God's power and God rescuing Daniel and his friends. Yeah.
So you would think Darius was a true believer. And why do you think he didn't change his the country's religion?
I think he's working in the power that he has. And let me, I'm glad you brought that up. Let me make note of this. So there was 3 decrees that happened with Daniel. The first is that first time with Nebuchadnezzar. I think the first one is at the fiery furnace. Then it goes to the statue. Wait, no. I can't remember what the first one is. But the first one recognizes that Israel and Daniel's God are powerful. The second one is that no one can stop them from worshiping their God. And now it's that everyone has to recognize that God is the most powerful God. So there is this escalation that kind of happens in the empire towards Daniel's God. And so maybe they had good freedom of religion there. But he does make this decree that everyone does recognize God. I can't remember what that first one was. I will look it up and put it in an email. Questions on this part or comments? Oh, good. Okay. So now that we have finished Daniel in the lion's den, do you know what that means? It's song time. So for the last time, today at least, you get to hear this beautiful song.
Alexander, before you start that, I like what you did about the lion's den. I had not thought about it. The last light bulb on the second page about it being the den is like Christ's tomb.
Oh,
and
yes.
The resurrection. I think.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
Yeah. And I did it. I couldn't fit. I had found another fun fact that a lot of early Christian art would use this story kind of the way that we talk about guardian angels today as this like hedge of protection for people who are following God. So this story kind of was far-reaching and an inspiration for lots of people. And the story of Daniel has lots of other connections to Jesus, which we'll see more today. I'll read that out loud in case people didn't see it. Some of early Christian interpretations saw lions as symbols of demonic powers that God kept at bay, and the den as a type of Christ's tomb, with Daniel emerging alive as a foreshadowing of resurrection. He goes down, he's reborn, he comes out a new person.
And alive. Yeah.
And maybe even more alive. Oh. You guys might be saved. I don't know how to make this. Go to the CD. Oh, here we go. Oh.
You can always find a map.
I have some coming up. Oh no. Let's see.
Throw a map up there.
Here we go.
Okay.
Oh no, it didn't play. All right, okay.
What is it?
It was the same song I played last week.
How about you, Boris?
Okay, so the chorus is in the heat of the flames, trust in God. He's a fire department. He's a rescue squad. Something, something, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flames. And I hope you still remember the song from last week because we have a discussion question on that song. Have you ever had your own moment in the heat of the flames where God came in and rescued you? If not, think about where you've seen God in moments past. I will give an example. When Rachel and I lost our house, it was a very sad moment, but it's now one of my most thankful moments because of the love and the support I saw through everyone else. Not only at this church, but strangers that showed up at our house to help us. It was a moment where I could have been at my lowest, but because of God and the people around us, I now attribute that to God wrapping us up in a hug. And I'm thankful for that moment. And so, it could have been the heat of the flames, but God came through. So that's our question to think about. In the lion's den, in the fiery furnace, have you seen God step in your own life? And I will play my timer, and then we will share some out loud if you want to break up into your groups.
It's the real deal.
Gosh, that scares me. That scares me every time it does that. This might be a different way for you to think about God and the way God acts. I have noticed in my life that churches tend to either talk more about God as a God of the big picture things, and like Jesus shows us the way how to live and kind of leaves the ball in our court. Like God is doing the big picture things. God is like the God of the cosmos. And then other people talk about God as God of the small things. God does things for me. God's very involved in my life and in the small day-to-day. I grew up with like a very, very small God, and then found my way thinking about God as a really big God. And then I was like, we can have both. And so this question might be a little different than the way that you typically think, but I am curious how you answered this. If anyone would want to share a story.
I noticed that we go to God when we're in trouble or afraid
Yeah,
or want a good answer to something.
that,
So
yeah.
in times of need, not so much as in times of praise and joy. Probably more joy. I need you to help me out with it.
And so I like to go like we have like God of the genie bottle, where we go to God in prayer when we want something or we need something. Having moments like this, where you practice thanksgiving, practice praise, can really help you in your rhythms of expanding beyond God of the genie bottle.
I think in my life,
Yeah.
The way I saw God the strongest is through people who supported me during crisis time.
Yeah.
And it's just such a wonderful, and you feel that presence, and that support. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts we're given is, support from other people.
That's really two gifts, the receiver and the giver.
Yes, yeah. God really does come to life when we come together. Might be why when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with you.
Yeah, we all had stories where angels, which helped us in such difficult situations that we would not have, where we were needed.
Yeah.
And they came unbidden. So I think of it as angels coming to me, as from God.
I know my family has stories of like someone had a car flipped over and someone just popped up on a road with no one around for miles, pulled them out of the car, and then there was no one there.
I actually had, when I was 12, we were driving in Nashville, not so Nashville. There was a flame we saw down the car. The car was on fire.
Oh.
We jumped out and somehow they got the fire out. And a couple was right there to take us. And, in fact, 6 of us in a little car. They drove us about, the rest of the way to Nashville. And went up to the hotel, took us right to the hotel. And that heat of the flames was kind of literal.
Well, I wish I would get that to play, but in the heat of the flames, trust in God. We have another discussion question before we move to the next chapter. I know we're fitting next week's discussions into today, but remember how Daniel goes up, he continues to pray, even though he knew this would lead to his sentencing for death. Why do you think Daniel continued praying openly, knowing the consequences? And what does that teach us, or you, about the balance between public witness and personal devotion? I'm going to wait like 10 seconds to start my timer. Why do you think Daniel continued praying openly, knowing the consequences? And what does that teach us about the balance between public witness and personal devotion? And then people I know some of these questions can be weird and quite personal, and so I just want to commend you all for, I think you're engaging with them. It looks like you are. And so, good job, and thank you. Hold on to these questions, in particular that one, how do we move forward in our lives with integrity, living in that empire? And this is a good question to keep thinking about too. What is kind of my balance with being this public witness, with my own personal devotion, and the balance between those things? Unfortunately, Daniel doesn't stay in those court stories of resistance. It does move forward to these visions. Typically, scholars call this the apocalyptic visions. As a reminder, we're calling them the visions of hope because they do bring hope. There is this hope that even though the world is broken, even though it doesn't matter who is king or what empire it is the same chaos day after day, era after era, generation after generation, no matter where you live. But one thing we hold to as Christians is God is doing something, and one day God's kingdom will come. And Daniel paints that picture, and that's what it's going to start pointing towards. And then we're going to look at some funny art because Daniel's going to start off with these visions of 4 beasts and a little horn. But does this look familiar to anyone? Like,
It looks like a kid's stuffed toy. I don't think it looks
like,
like
is it like where? That's where the wild things grow. Like. When I had it, I was like, that guy looks really familiar. And Sabra's here late Wednesday nights a lot, and I often end up showing her the funny pictures that I find. And sometimes I need Sabra's help with stuff. And she was like, that's from the kids' book. Yeah, I think that's interesting. There's just lots of interesting art with these four creatures. My favorite, though, and I want like a lot of people will just talk about this as the vision of the four beasts, but hold on to the little horn, and I want one of these to be engraved in your mind, and when you go to sleep at night, I want you to think about this little horn with a little face on it. When I was getting these this week, Poppy was supposed to be taking a nap, and I just hear this chuckle, and she goes, "Why does that horn have a little face?" We're going to see why in a minute. But I want you to just hold on to this. There's one beast that has 10 horns. On that is a 10th horn that we call the little horn. It doesn't stay little, but it blasphemes and accuses the people of God. And so, here's that mouth with it yelling at it. Here's another picture of the four beasts that's maybe a little more depictive of what we're about to walk through. I think I put I did. In the handout, I put the descriptions here so you didn't have to write them down, because there is a lion with eagle's wings. There's a bear that's raised to one side, and it has 3 tusks in its mouth. There's a leopard that has 4 wings. And then there's this terrifying beast that has iron teeth, and it has 10 horns, and part of the 10 horns is the little horn. And don't forget the little horn. Just keep that guy in your mind. You're welcome. So we're going to start off with Daniel having these visions. There is a timeline that it's going to give us. We have scooted back in time. Remember, Daniel kind of gets arranged a little bit funny sometimes. So we're back before Darius is here. We're back to Belshazzar, who's already dead. In the first year, though, he has this vision. He's going to see this lion with eagle's wings. This is going to represent Babylon. We'll break through the meanings in a moment. That bear raised on one side is going to represent the Medo-Persian Empire. The leopard with the 4 wings is going to represent Greece. In particular, it's Alexander the Great in his conquest. When Alexander, I'm supposed to wait to explain it. And then that terrifying beast that's going to come, and especially the little horn, is the Antiochus IV, who we talked about when we started Daniel, but he's the guy that invades the temple and he sets up the idols inside and everything. When we get to the next chapter, it also is going to get very specific with some of the history that happens. So I will mention some of that there. Let's see. If you don't want to memorize what these are, because I don't know why you would want to, but his vision, very similar to the statue, is a succession of empires and of kings who are going against God. That's the summary of this, if you want to fade out in your mind and go somewhere else. While he's having this vision, he's also going to have this vision of this divine court and the Son of Man. My Bible calls this section judgment before the Ancient One. I'm just curious what other people's Bibles call this section.
Same.
Verses 9 through 14. You're saying the judgment before the Ancient One?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. I followed most of my Bible's headings for these, but I changed this one. And we'll see why in a moment. So there, Daniel gets caught up in the scene of heaven. To me, this chapter really reminds me of Revelation. And you might remember when we talked about the book of Revelation, is that Daniel 7 and Daniel 10 get pulled into the book of Revelation a lot. And so we're going to meet this Ancient One at first. The Ancient One is a picture of God on the throne. And I want to take a pause as a moment and remember that at this time, people didn't have the Nicene Creed, and they didn't have what nerdy church people call the Chalcedonian definition, which is the very explanatory creed almost or definition about the relationship between the Trinity as God the Father and Creator and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. Take that as a moment back because people don't think about Jesus as being God yet. And it takes them a while when Jesus is on earth to see that. And so this ancient one is about God on the throne. He's also going to have this talking about the Son of Man, and I'll show you some art of that in a moment. When we as Christians talk about the Son of Man, we mean Jesus. That's not what it meant here. The Son of Man meant kind of all of Israel, but anyone who's working for God. And it's also tied to that messianic figure. The gospel writers take that, what's happening here in Daniel, and say Jesus is a fulfillment of that. A lot of modern translations, and I think I put this in the fun facts. Oh, yeah, it's the very first one. Is that sometimes they'll say like one who appeared like a human. And sometimes churches will say Son of Man is the truly human one. And I really like that. I think that's a good description of what Son of Man is. It just doesn't sound as cool, especially in the Gospel of John. Also in this segment, it says in verse 11, we're going to learn about this arrogant horn that is speaking, and it's throwing insults at God and the people of God. And so that's where that little horn comes in and why it has a mouth. And I think that little horn is really important when we kind of dissect how this chapter plays out and what it means. Because we're caught up with God the Father on the throne who's in charge of all things. We see this little horn who is defiling God and the people of God. And the solution or the rescue for that is this one like a Son of Man, this one who appears like a human, who is kind of going to end up being the one who reigns forever. And so we call that the Messiah, and we as Christians say that Messiah is Jesus. Does that make sense?
Now, my Bible says a mouth speaking great things. The horn, the little horn.
Great
I looked
things.
at it because of the sound of the great words which the horn was speaking. It doesn't seem to say defile. Or, you know, that it was.
Finish that verse, though. What happens to the beast with the horn on it?
Who was slain, body destroyed, given over to be burned in fire.
Yeah, he wasn't a good beast and not a good horn.
So is great being used in a.
I think he's powerful. And what we're going to learn, so with this talking about Antiochus IV, he was a very powerful guy. And we'll talk about why he was the little horn that becomes the big horn. Because he took the Seleucid Empire, that was one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and he spread that empire all the way into Egypt. Or coming up against Egypt, but he goes through Israel and Palestine and defiles everything there. Not a good guy, though. Not the example we want to be like. We want to be like Daniel.
What is the symbolism of the horns? How do they use them?
Yes, so for a lot of not just Greek kings, but they would make on their coins, their kings would have horns, and that represents their power. I think it's kind of related to like how we wear crowns. Like I think of a crown, the bigger the crown, the more powerful the king. And there's 10 horns because there's roughly about 10 kings from Alexander the Great before we get to Antiochus IV. Is why there's 10. Okay. We'll get to the horns and the beast in a moment, but I want to draw your attention to some of this art with the ancient one. Here's the ancient one. The ancient one is to say God is eternal. And so, there's white hair and there's all of this power because no one is as powerful or as old as God, which is to say that it may look like the big bad empire and the big bad king is ruling over the world right now, but zoom out and think about it from God's perspective. God's in charge, and no one is as powerful as God is. Here's some art with the Son of Man. This one kind of blends that together. The Son of Man, the ancient one, put together. Here's the ancient one here. You might not be able to see it, but kind of sitting in his lap is the Son of Man. And this is kind of surrounded, this is taking imagery from Revelation like this. I put this in the fun facts too. It's the second one. But what's I think is really cool is that the prologue of Revelation mixes these two pictures together. And so if you'll remember when we were in Revelation, when it talks about Jesus, it uses these descriptions of the Ancient One from back here in Daniel that are talking about God the Father. I think that's just really cool. And we're kind of merging those pictures together. And again, that's because we as the people of God have come to know more about God since Daniel was written. So we put that in Revelation. Okay.
Is Daniel the only book that's a tale in the Bible?
Sorry, say what?
Is Daniel the only book that is a tale?
That is a tale. There are lots of stories that get rewritten and retold and morph and change. One of the cool things I think about Daniel is because it represents the story of inspiration for everyone. And so we kind of have more versions of it and it morphed around. If you hear people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was the community at Qumran. And we have other versions of Daniel, like, for instance, chapter 6 with Daniel in the lion's den has another version that's a little bit different. Lots of Bible stories, we have other versions like that float around, particularly for ones from the Hebrew Bible. Like in Genesis, we talked about that when this class went through there. Kind of scholars today think that it was kind of two versions that get put together. That's kind of the origin story. And so some of those stories were centered around Abraham, and that gets put into Genesis. Other stories were formed around Moses, and that gets put into Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then Deuteronomy retells kind of all of those. But these are all, these were stories that got passed down, like for the ones in Genesis, for like 1,000 years before they get written. And so they kind of, they're going to go through variations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question that probably shows my ignorance about history. But in terms of these actual historical events and the time that the book of Daniel was written, enlighten me.
So we talked about this in the first week. And do you have this page? So it's a 2nd century BCE writing, but it's telling stories from the 6th century back in the exile. So
it all had already happened.
Yes, yeah. So, parts of it though, because Daniel has like 3 stages of how it gets written together. So scholars today will say what we finished, the court stories, that those come way back from during the exile. When we get to now with the visions, though, this doesn't happen until the middle of the 2nd century, around 160 or so. 164 is when, it's either 167 or 164 is when the Maccabean revolt happens. And that's in response to what Antiochus IV does. Like, we're going to read about what he does in the temple. It's going to talk about some of the priests that were alive then and what they did in the next chapter. But that happens, it's either 164 or 167 in that time frame. I'm going to move us forward with time because we're going to talk about the interpretation of this. I'm going to go a little bit quicker through this. We talked about how this is the 4 kingdoms. So it's Babylon, it's Medo-Persia, Alexander the Great, and then we're going to see Alexander the Great's descendants essentially as his empire gets broken up. Here's a map of this. So Alexander the Great had one big empire. He was a great conqueror. He was not a good ruler. And so after he conquered the whole world, and then he dies in his 30s, his kingdom gets broken up into 4 sections. That's because there was 4 generals. Some of them were bigger than others. Some of the main ones that last is the Seleucids. They kind of roughly take over Persia, Babylon area. There's the Ptolemies. They take over Egypt. There's some others that are a little west, and we don't care about those. Here's a circle of some of them together, but you have the ones that are centered here, and then this is the ones, they have a different name in the text, but they are the ones around Macedonia or around Greece. That's kind of roughly the four that get broken up. At first, the Seleucid Empire is small, but it ends up growing over time and becomes bigger. And so we talked about this in our beginning, but they end up spreading. There's roughly a series of 10 kings until you get to Antiochus IV. He's the one that comes through, and on his way to conquer Egypt, because he wants to take over the world, they pass through Israel. And he's not a good guy, and so he goes into the temple, and he defiles the temple. They set up an altar to the Greek god. I talk about this in more detail in the next chapter. So I'm going to wait, and we're going to move to the next chapter. Chapter 8, Daniel is going to have this vision of a ram and of a goat. Oh, I wanted to show this to you too, because in art, you don't have movies, and so they will often duplicate things, and that's to show time progression. So if you ever see something like this, it's to tell time. And so here's the ram that has 2 horns, and the male goat with 1 horn. Then he has 10 horns, and there's a 1 horn woohoo. And here's another picture of it. So he has multiple horns, and there's one really big one, and they fight. That's what happens in his vision. Just as a note, this isn't really that important, but the language switched back to Hebrew now. And so chapter 1 was in Hebrew, then it was in Aramaic. Now we've changed back into Hebrew. Again, that's because these are written in different times. In this vision, there's a 2-horned ram and there's a male goat. What was I going to say about this? Oh, the 2 horns represent the Medo-Persian Empire because they were kind of like a dual empire. It was the Medians and the Persians are ruling together. That male goat that is from the west is Alexander the Great, and he comes in like a spear that's really sharp and takes over, just like in history. Alexander the Great conquered the world really, really fast. His dad helped him out by building up some armies, but he was kind of a crazy guy that thought he was appointed by God, and he fought at the front lines, and he just did insane stuff. And so that's how it plays out in the story, too. This goat comes in really quick. That goat's horn is going to get broken into 4. Again, Alexander the Great dies. There are 4 generals that take over the empire after he dies. And that small horn is Antiochus IV, who's going to desecrate the temple. This little horn is going to have some blasphemy. We can pick that up in verse 9. Out of one of them, so one of the 10 horns, came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took on the regular burnt offerings away from him and overthrew the place of the sanctuary. Because of the wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings. And it goes on to talk about the bad stuff that he does. This is a weird description, but it's describing how the Seleucids and Antiochus IV actually took over different places. So it goes through the directions. They were there in the east. And so he is going to move and go south, and then he's going to move into the beautiful land. That's Israel. He's going to come and conquer Israel. One thing he actually does in history, I don't have the picture. I don't know where I put the picture. But I think I have it a little bit later. He sacrifices a pig there. And so I don't know where that picture is. On the altar, and if you know anything about kosher laws, that's pretty sacrilegious. He's really doing everything he can to do wrong. There is a mention here of timing. And he answered let me pick up in verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, which is an angel. For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgressions that make desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled? And he answered, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. What happened in history is that's how long Antiochus IV occupied Jerusalem. And so it's giving mention to that time and saying, look, it looks bad right now, but it won't last forever. I know these visions, just like in Revelation, can be really confusing when you look at them. That's why I always say for apocalyptic text, have a really good commentary because it can explain some of those weird details because they are weird. Gabriel is then going to interpret this version. So he's going to explain what I already just explained, I guess, because I did it out of order. I just want to say this one part. There's a priest that's mentioned, and I heard a human voice by Uriah calling, Gabriel, help this man understand the vision. That was a real priest that lived right before the Maccabean revolt. And he's going to explain all of these. He's going to talk about the Medes and the Persians. He's going to talk about the king of Greece. He's going to talk about the four kingdoms. My note says broken, and I don't know why. Oh, we already mentioned that because the horns break, and there's four of them. It's the generals. Daniel's response to all of this, though, is that he is dismayed. He is kind of really freaking out. I put a map on here for you to see what happens, by the way. Not a map, a timeline. So this is when Antiochus IV comes in. It's about a 7-year period. In the middle is when he makes the sacrifice. He's also going to put a statue to Jupiter, that's the Greek god, inside the temple. After that 7 years is when the Maccabeans come in and revolt. That's in 167. Oh, 164 is when the revolt starts. And it was in response to the temple. No, 167 is when the revolt starts. 164 is when the Maccabeans actually win. And remember, time works backwards because we're counting down to 0. And it's okay if you get confused, because I'm confused too. And so here's that picture of him sacrificing the pig up on the altar. I know we just went through that really, really quickly, but is there a question on that part of the vision? I know that was fast. Yeah.
That's a quick one. I'm a real concrete thinker.
Okay.
Fortunately, with all this. So all this dream, I mean, nobody could really have those dreams. So this is a vehicle that the author used to explain what happens in history or what's going to happen. And did they write it after it already happened to explain that it happened?
That would depend on what lens that you look at. So some people do believe that this part of Daniel was written back in 656, back in exile, and is explaining history that happens forward.
And all these, I mean, the Bible uses dreams, all people have.
Yes, yeah.
You got Joseph and Jacob and Ten Commandments. So, but I mean, Revelations and this really gets out there as far as dreams. So,
Yeah.
I mean, did anybody really have those kind of dreams?
Well, yeah, because like when this part of Daniel was written, they are living, like they are living through this, like at that time.
At that time.
Yeah. And also as a note, like sometimes the timelines in Daniel's, we'll see this next week. Like we can see where it's gone through a revision because one paragraph will give a timeline with days, and then the next paragraph will correct the one before it. And so really it's a living tale. It's the people living through it. They're trying to make sense of the chaos around them. And it's to say like, hey, it looks bad now, but God will come in and rescue you, just like all apocalyptic visions.
But
Could you put the screen that was preceded? Thank you.
But all these visions are just a vehicle to.
That is what more modern scholars and probably most people in the Episcopal Church would say, is that it's a tale that's explaining the history after it has happened.
Okay.
And it's telling it like it's going to happen in the future, but it tells it that way to give inspiration and hope to us. Also,
Right.
this is so much more exciting to read than like a history book. I mean, I think so. And so, just like we do the same thing with history. Like,
Yeah.
I remember that's the movie, I think it was called Pearl Harbor, was how I learned about Pearl Harbor. It's about the pilots that
You mean
that
the
flight.
movie
The movie Pearl Harbor, yeah. That was how I learned the most about Pearl Harbor. I'm sure I learned about it in school, but it wasn't fun that way. And so when you have a story with characters and the characters make sense, like it makes the story more memorable. It also makes it more inspiring in the way you plug in to the stories that we live through. Because like we live through the same story Daniel does today.
That's why historical fiction is such a wonderful learning tool.
Yes, yeah. And as a note, like people didn't, when this was written, it wasn't the author trying to trick the people. This is how they told stories.
Right.
This is literature. Yeah. Woo. Okay. We're not going to answer this discussion question, but oh, sorry, Marilyn.
Oh, good, thank you.
Okay. Daniel is overwhelmed by this vision after seeing the history to unfold in the waiting period. So in the text, it's, hey, all this bad stuff is going to happen. It's going to last years and years and years. Okay. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by what you see in the world? And then how does Daniel's reaction help us process our own experiences today? We're not going to answer that together because I want to play the video for you. But hold on to that question. Daniel was overwhelmed. If you're overwhelmed by what's happening right now, you're in good company. And, you know, we have said this a lot, but the story isn't over yet. God is coming and God will act. All the points of apocalyptic literature are to say, God came in and did something then, God will do it again. And so hold on. And just like Daniel, hold on with integrity. Okay. Good job. You did it. You survived the apocalyptic stories. We're going to play the Bible Project video again. I think that was all I was going to tell you. Yes. So if you don't want to watch it again, I will see you next week. Yeah.
Any reason that or significance to the fact that he can interpret other people's dreams but not his own?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Because it's not him interpreting it, but God. I'm just making that answer up, but it sounds nice.
I didn't say my question right. Well, he can interpret other people, but he can't. Why can't he interpret his own? I don't understand. Maybe I don't understand, right?
Oh, I don't know.
Well,
yeah.
There's no answer on that.
Well, it is Jacob.
The Book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and that puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. So the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about two Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power. And so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these two stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts. And like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire. And it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament. And there's one specific horn, who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution. These are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is an image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense, they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
We're not yet done with Daniel. We will finish those other chapters next week, which I still encourage you to come, even though we've had a preview of it, because we'll also talk about how generations after this continued to adapt it in Greek, and they told more stories. And some of, particularly Bel and the Dragon, is my favorite of the Greek editions. So we'll talk about that. The Lord be with you. My God, we thank you for Daniel. We thank you for stories throughout the Bible of people who live with integrity, but also live with mistakes. We pray that we would live with integrity, but we thank you that you forgive us when we don't. Be with us this day and all days and in all places. Amen.
Amen.